Morning, everybody. Buenos dias, bonjour. Il me fait grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous, but I'm just sad that we're not in Montreal. I'm sad that you all are all over the world, which is wonderful. But Montreal is a wonderful city, as is Quebec and Ottawa, and I still hope that you can come here perhaps at some other time. Because we're all dispersed and not physically here, it is awkward perhaps to acknowledge that I am on unceded Indigenous lands, and perhaps some of the rest of you are as well. And this is something that is important to us. I am pleased to have a co-leader in this panel, and I would like to introduce her. I would like to introduce María Juliana Angarita, who is completing a PhD in museology, médiation, patrimoine at the L'Université du Québec à Montréal, under the supervision of Professor Jennifer Carter. She's a core member of the Beyond Museum Walls research project for public dialogue around difficult history and cultural conflict, based at the Curating and Public Scholarship Lab at Concordia University. Her doctoral research explores how the memory practices of historically marginalized victims of atrocity foster new approaches to and uses of heritage building from below in peace building contexts. And I would like now to pass the word over to Maria Juliana.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for your introduction. Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. For those who do not know Madame Anne Davis, she has retired as the director of the Nicol Arts Museum at the University of Calgary, where she's also initiated and taught in the program of Museum and Heritage Studies. She's a past president of ICOFOM. Currently, she is an external advisor to the Acquisition Committee of the National Gallery of Canada and is working with a dedicated group attempting to create a portrait gallery for Canada. It is a pleasure to co-preside this first session of the symposium with you, Anne. And I give you the floor again so you can give us more details about the way in which we are going to proceed.
Thank you, Maria Juliana. So, as you know, from the last amazing session, my goodness, I think that we have a challenge in front of us to complete with Elizabeth Kane and her just incredible project. So you can ask questions. In fact, we hope you will ask questions. So please pose them in the Q&A box. In English, if possible. Unfortunately, while there has been English-French interpretation and will be in English-French interpretation for the major speakers, there is not that for the panels. So if you can do it in English, that would be great. The discussion, we'll have the three panelists present their papers first, and then we'll have the discussion. So I would like to introduce François, which is a great pleasure for me because I've been lucky enough to work with François Mairesse for many years, probably even decades, François. It's a little bit embarrassing, maybe. François Mairesse is a museologist. He's professeur d'économie de la culture et titulaire de la chaire UNESCO sur l'étude de la diversité muséale et son évaluation, Museum Prospect à l'Université Sorbonne Nouvelle, Paris 3. He was the director of the Musée Royal de Mariemont in Belgium from 2002 to 2010, and he is past president of ICOFOM from 2013 to 2019. François, je vous donne la parole.
Thank you very much, and I'm really glad to be here. Unfortunately, I'm not in Montreal, and I'm really disappointed not to be in that beautiful city of Montreal, actually. So the title of my my short article was Decolonizing Museology, and it was actually the global title of the symposium somehow. And definitely, as we mostly know, I would like to say, what is decolonizing museums? Of course, we had this beautiful intervention just before, considering ways of dealing with museums in a post-colonial context somehow. We know that it's about restitution of objects, of changing and collaborating with the display. We know that it's type of new forms of collaborations, new productions of new forms of knowledge, etc. But what could be the decolonization of museology? And somehow we know that it's not in practice. It's a kind of theoretical topic, which is much more difficult somehow. Actually, there are a lot of articles concerning decolonization of museums. There are not so many actually dealing with decolonization of museology. One I would like to refer to is an article written by Bruno Brulon-Soares and Anna Leschenko a couple of years ago, which stated very clearly from theoretical literature, museological literature, how you could think about a kind of decolonization process. The topic was very interesting. They were studying the number of references written in English and in French and in other from other writers in some specific important works in museology. The International Handbook of Museum Studies, written and edited by Sharon MacDonald, the Dictionnaire encyclopédique de muséologie in French by André Desvallées and myself, and also the ICOFOM study series. And the objective results that they got was very interesting to point, because for the International Handbook of Museum Studies, 83% of the references were written from English-speaking authors, only 4% in French, and 1% from people outside of Europe or Western countries, which of course means something very interesting. And the point was mostly this, mostly the same for what concerned the Dictionnaire encyclopédique de muséologie, with 50% of the reference written in French and from French authors, French-speaking authors, 33% from English-speaking persons, and 1% actually also from really people outside of Europe. So somehow their conclusion was, this is, of course, a kind of way of conceiving museology, which is supposed to be global, but which is not global at all. And because a major part of the world is not tackled by this review of literature. The conclusion, I will just quote it, says partly, the theory of museology produced over the past half century to define its own moral interpretation of reality has been shown to be marked by paradigms created within colonial structures of power, excluding approaches and experiences that cannot be translated culturally or linguistically into the discourse of the epistemic centers. So it means that, of course, there were some exclusions, and somehow the decolonization process of museology would be to have a kind of more inclusive approach. And somehow also, they showed that the ICOFOM literature was maybe the most inclusive approach, trying to have some proposals and views from really all around the world. Of course, we could have different reactions concerning this type of view. The first one, which actually is not quite often, but is kind of a typical French reaction, should be to reject post-colonialism and saying that it's kind of nonsense, etc. I'm trying to reading this book, for instance, which is called L'imposture décoloniale, which says that decolonialism is something that is not should not be included within science, etc., etc. So this is the first type of reaction. There would be another type of reaction saying, okay, this is very important, we should be more inclusive, etc. I think that we could, of course, definitely integrate this process, but we should also discuss the hypotheses, the assumptions that are included within this type of way of thinking. And I will try to discuss 4 underlying assumptions that are behind this way of considering museological literature. The first one is linked with the temporality within history. Of course, as it is written, it seems that French and English-speaking people are just dominant people, and because of the languages that are so widespread, it's impossible not to dominate. And of course, these were the 2 major empires during the 19th century, and they continue somehow to rule the academic world. Well, actually, I would be really pleased to as a French-speaking person, to continue to dominate the world, but actually, I'm afraid this is not exactly anymore the case. And of course, especially French-speaking literature within museology, but in all academic world is declining, and it's still continuing to decline. And my point is that, of course, it's very important, if you consider these things, just to think about not a specific moment, but to see the evolution. And of course, you have a kind of general evolution that continues to degrow for French-speaking way of conceiving the world through academic, within the academic field, but also, of course, the perspective that's actually 80% of the literature, or 85% of the literature in science are written in English, but also that some literature that was mostly in existence a couple of decades ago, for instance, in Portuguese, it's much more widespread now than it used to be. And especially, I would say, of course, for what concerns the museological part, we know that, especially from ICOFOM, that it's such an important source of thought, and it has been at least for 2 decades. So my first point is, of course, that think about the temporality of this. My second hypothesis, or the second hypothesis, the second assumption, seems to concede the fact that actually museological literature is widespread all around the world. But it would mean also that there are exactly more or less the same amount of literature all around the world. We do not have a clear idea of how many actually articles or books, etc., we have in the museological field. So it's very difficult to tackle these questions. But we have some indexes in order to try to see how equilibrated it is around the world or not. For instance, if you think about the distribution of museums and museum professionals, or if you think about the distribution of documentation centers in museology around the world. And if you consider, for instance, the museums, actually 80%, well, 45% of the museums are supposed to be distributed in Northern America, and 35% in Western Europe, and actually only 5% in Latin America, 5% in Asia. So somehow also it's very important to concede that it's more or less the same for what concerns the documentation center in museology. 52% are located in Northern America or Western Europe, and only 12% in Latin America, for instance. So it's important to understand that, of course, it might mean that the literature, the museological literature, is of course not exactly spreads harmoniously in the world. So it might also explain this disproportion that you could observe in some anthologies and handbooks, etc. The third hypothesis seems to assume somehow that the theoretical productions is assumed to be to address the whole world. And actually, this is also somehow that could be discussed, because I would say that, of course, some authors would like to address their thoughts all around the world, but a lot of the other ones are just writing for the country. They're just writing for their own population, I would say. A lot of people, and if I take some people from France, a lot of French writers are just writing for French people. And they are not actually, unfortunately, I would say, they are not so much interested by the rest of the world. And it happens in a lot of countries. It happens, of course, in the United States. It happens in United Kingdom. It happens also in Germany, in Brazil, etc. And it means that actually, unfortunately, just a tiny percent of the museologist population try to have a global view. Of course, you could find them in ICOFOM, because a lot of them, and especially people such as Bruno Brulon or Nalashenko, try to grab a global view. But somehow, this is also very interesting to see that it's partly unusual, I would say. And my fourth point is the fact that, of course, it would be nice to consider that if you have a clever idea, if you have a kind of original idea, then it should be widespread. It should widespread from itself, because it's so nice that, of course, everybody would widespread it around the world. But somehow it's not like that it works, I would say. And if you take, for instance, what Bruno Latour and other people, sociologists in science, wrote about the diffusion of science, you see how strategical work you need to make in order to widespread your thoughts. So all of these proposals and discussion try to understand more the kind of way, or the kind of reason why it's not only, I would say, kind of a post-colonial or colonial power, so-called colonial power, that would try to grab the information and the academic thought, but it might be much more complex. And what's more, and this is my last point, I would say also that, of course, if post-colonial criticism is very interesting to analyze the world and to analyze museums especially, and I'm really glad about this symposium. It's also it could be also maybe more appropriate not to look only at the history of colonialism, etc., but actually on the contemporary way of colonization of the world. And somehow the previous empires that ruled the world in the 19th century are not anymore the real empires. And it could be more interesting, I might say, to think more maybe about these new powers and these fights that could be more studied from a geopolitical point of view than just think about decolonialization. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, François, very much. I'm sure that in the discussion that there'll be lots of questions to follow up on your very interesting presentation. I would like now to turn to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Petrunina Liubov, who has a PhD, who for 32 years worked in the State Tretyakov Gallery as a researcher in inventory, in sociology and methodology, and in the PR. She's an author of more than 50 articles, 2 books concerning the social image of museum visitors. For 5 years, she delivered a special course on gallery management in Liubov Moscow State University. And I turn it over to you now.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in the symposium. I'd like to show my presentation, yes, and a comment, something. Considering papers submitted to 45 ICOFOM symposium, we can understand that decolonization of museology perceived by authors as opportunity to induce new way of restitution of museum objects and describing new museum displays and practice. During the middle of 20th century, there were 3 waves of restitution, which concerns thousands of museum objects. Let's remember what we know about the further existence of this repatriated museum object. Once we have received the answer on those questions, we can start to analyze the demand to return the museum objects to indigenous groups. But I'd like to emphasize that these objects acquire the status of value in the Eurocentric museums only. Now, are we going to transfer just physical object or carrier of a certain value? We should remember that returned heritage changes the framework of assessment from values of humanity items become the heritage only of indigenous. By doing so, we are losing the universality of the world and do step down on the local level. Slogan of the decolonization of museology today send us back in the time, as we may see in the paper from Zimbabwe, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, etc. I could not let pass my attention on the paper by Zimbaraj Shadrach Chitima from Zimbabwe, which concludes the research regarding the decolonization efforts employed by national museums with government support. He notes that even after 40 years of independence, museums are viewed by Zimbabweans as still foreign. The main conclusion of this research was the need to decolonize the mental frameworks. I would like to notice the term of decolonization introduces an element of tension into the museum context, dividing museum specialists of different countries. Slogan of the decolonization of museology also carries a negative connotation because it is associated with the passive action of obtaining values in opposite to the creative transformation of reality. I'd like to quote from the paper by Leon Peterson Belinfat from Brazil. One clear example that only decolonization is not very effective is the Indigenous Museum in Rio de Janeiro, which closed due to a lack of visitors. On another note, good examples of functioning decolonization are the different exhibitions at the Te Papa Museum in Wellington, New Zealand. Modern museum practice includes intensive exchange of museum collections around the world to create exhibitions addressed to all kinds of visitors, including the indigenous people, and it does not require a special decolonization policy. The reflection of the, sorry, sorry, the reflection about the decolonization reveals the deep gap between their theory and actual museum practice. There were many examples of good practice and interrelationships in the book of papers submitted to 45 ICOFOM symposium. In my opinion, we could designate this process as deconstruction of cultural field, not as decolonization. The history of museum origin allows us to understand a museum's role in the society as a tool of presenting one social group to another. In consequence of changing the social political structure of society, certain social groups came to the forefront of cultural life and used museums to demonstrate their significance in the society. Thus, in the second half of the 19th century, after the reforms of Emperor Alexander II, which changed the economic system of Russia, a new social class of industrialists and traders appeared and used museums to demonstrate its significance in the society. Consequently, the historical museum in Moscow, the Ostroukov Gallery, the Moscow City Art Gallery of the Tretyakov brothers, and many other provincial museums were founded as self-governed and self-supported. This pre-revolutionary network of museums had become the basis of the state museum network in Soviet Russia. They were involved in the strategies of political education. In the aftermath of the changing social and economic situation after the dismantling of the Soviet system in the 1990s, numerous private museums of various collections have been founded not only in the both capitals but in the province. During the last 2 decades, museums working with difficult themes have appeared. The most famous of these are the Museum of the History of the Gulag in Moscow and the Perm 36 Museum. They present the stories of the destinies of 30 million Soviet people who suffered under the state repressive system in the USSR for over 40 years. These state museums arose under the pressure from the human rights movement onto the government structures. In 1995, by the initiative of the Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who at the time returned to Russia, the House of Russians Abroad was founded. It was dedicated to hundreds of thousands of immigrants who forced emigration after 1917 in the period of the Civil War and the Red Terror. The appearance of such museums in Russia reflects processes similar to those described in the thesis proposed for the 44th ICOFOM Symposium in Canada. As we can see, such situations are not unique. They are repeated at different times in different countries. The problem should be reformatted. Can such process be considered as the decolonization of cultural field? I think no, they can't. The history of organizing museums reveal its instrumental capabilities, which are used by different social and professional groups to attain their goals within society. Such goals might vary tremendously, from patriotic items in the Museum of Russians Abroad to technological goals oriented to developing strategy for certain corporations. After at the International Conference of Corporate Museums in Russia, the chief of the company Avesta said, "A corporate museum helps us to find the answers to construct the activity of our concern in order to be useful for society in the future." New museum practices through broad engagement of different social groups such as sponsors, friends of museum societies, volunteers, local communities, migrants, indigenous, and so on lead to deconstruction of museum field all over the world. Consequently, a museum becomes a social institution along with institutions of education, family, religions, etc. And management scheme things from the past do not correspond to the modern museum practice. Museums today demonstrate abilities of self-development, considering social functions of the museum in the process of development of the new museum definition through the prism of decolonization, we inevitably narrow the diversity of museum connections. Modern museum movement has trend to democratization through using IT and engagement different social groups. We should not discourage the widespread movement by careers use of terms such as decolonization. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Madame Liubov. Thank you for your presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Madame Susana Manjarres, our last panelist. Unfortunately, Mr. Ernest Capan, curator of the Ministère de la Culture de la Francophonie de Côte d'Ivoire, won't be able to join us today. Madame Susana Manjarres is a social psychologist, and she works at Mexico's Coordinación Nacional de Museos y Exposiciones, National Office for Museums and Exhibitions, at Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, Mexico's National Institute for Anthropology and History. Her paper is titled The Decolonization of the Word, from the museum with a capital M to its publics and the communities in which it operates, ? Susana will make her presentation in Spanish. Unfortunately, there won't be a translation for those who do not speak Spanish. Therefore, allow me to share a brief description of her paper in English. Referring to Mandujano's definition of coloniality, Susana Manjarres will analyze how museums create spaces for the reproduction of colonial discourses and practices, and how these institutions promote power asymmetries, especially between experts and communities. She argues, and I quote, "In order to decolonize discourses, we must first decolonize thought. To decolonize practices, we must first decolonize the processes of construction of discourse and blur the line that separates the inside and the outside of the museum, without losing sight of the interrelation, almost diffuse, of the dimensions of coloniality." End of quote. Thank you, Susana. Bienvenida y el micrófono virtual es tuyo. I think we lost Susana. You have to, yeah, exactly.
Hi.
Thank you. Bienvenida.
Thank you. I'm from Mexico City, the only place where I have lived, and now I'm here trying to speak a language that is not mine, but that someday someone said that it was the universal language. Well, maybe someone else believed that even Spanish isn't my language because of the history of my country. Right now, thinking about the thematic of this important symposium, and in my last sentence too, that is one of the first ideas that I could identify in the land of the conquest, thinking about mine. Esto que menciono me sirve como preámbulo, primero, para hablar de las correlaciones entre colonialismo como hecho histórico, descolonización como procesos de independencia, colonialidad como producto del hecho histórico y como efecto en la dimensión del pensamiento, y de colonialidad del poder, del saber y del ser. A partir de lo cual, una de mis principales inquietudes se centra en cómo se interrelacionan estas dimensiones de la colonialidad del pensamiento en el campo de los museos, y esto, a su vez, cómo se relaciona con sus públicos y comunidades. Busco posibles respuestas a esta pregunta pensando en el museo como institución del saber, en sus discursos y en su sujeto del saber. dejo un poco de lado la discusión actual sobre la definición de museo, mas no la necesidad de encontrar una definición en común, que también resulta única y que también resulte unívoca o unilateral, ya que de acuerdo con la aún vigente definición, el museo es una institución al servicio de la sociedad y abierta al público, con quienes también faltaría discutir su sentido. Sobre los discursos del museo, representados principalmente en sus exposiciones, otras de las preguntas que me surgen son: ¿de qué manera el museo puede no quedar atrapado en la potencia colonizadora? No solo sobre el espacio para exponer discursos científicos, legitimados y atrapados en el estatismo del pensamiento de la época en la que se tejieron, sino también a través de sus prácticas mismas dentro de la institución. Por una parte, los espacios museales se inclinan a ser lugares de reproducción, consciente o no, de acuerdo con Sterman, de la colonialidad del pensamiento, de la academicidad del saber, del androcentrismo de sus categorías y conceptos directivos y de la falsa universalidad de sus pretensiones, entre las cuales se imbrinca el ejercicio de poder. Por otra parte, al hablar de los sujetos del saber en el espacio museal, primero, es necesario dirigir la mirada hacia la preponderancia de los roles que se juegan desde las distintas áreas del museo, donde la definición del contenido de las exposiciones, al ser exclusiva del investigador como experto, hace más evidente la simetría, primero hacia sus colegas, no investigadores, y luego hacia los públicos y comunidades. Así, los saberes surgen desde la ciencia y del investigador como portavoz de lo que se dice y cómo se dice. Destaco la suma de esfuerzos de algunos colegas por actualizar los guiones desde un planteamiento colaborativo entre áreas y desde distintas experiencias, con el interés de que también respondan a contextos actuales y donde también hace falta la participación de sus públicos y comunidades, estrechar lazos con quienes les visitan o tender puentes con aquellos que no, y mermar así en el potencial del guión de museo como instrumento de poder. Me pregunto si en la práctica será esto posible tanto como en el ideal. Sin duda, es en los públicos en quienes podría recaer la voz de la autocrítica del museo y la posibilidad de alejarnos de discursos que no contribuyan a reflexionar sobre los problemas de la comunidad donde se asientan, idea que lleva atrapada décadas en un simulacro, en el ejercicio de estrategias que no logran ser una condición permanente. Y es que no puede haber un discurso o argumento decolonial sin una práctica. Dicho lo anterior, se trata también de reconocer la fragilidad del museo. Se debe asumir su condición vulnerable ante los discursos dominantes y hacer consciente la necesidad de un cambio de paradigma o de pensamiento, pero sobre todo de la ruptura de las propias estructuras de las prácticas cotidianas. Es necesario evidenciar y hacer presente que para decolonizar los discursos, primero hay que decolonizar el pensamiento. Para decolonizar las prácticas, primero hay que decolonizar los procesos de construcción de los discursos, o viceversa, y desdibujar la línea que separa el adentro y el afuera del museo, sin perder de vista la interrelación casi difusa en las dimensiones de la colonialidad. In my text proposal, the central question is, how can we change the museum to make it closer to its visitors and communities, thinking about museal practices and the role of its disciplines? How can we decolonize the museum if we don't change our practice? Certainly, I have more questions than answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susana. Thank you for the exercise also of introducing your panel. Thank you everyone for your thought-provoking presentations, interventions. You all have raised issues related to language, to communication between different fields, between different poles of power, different groups, how we as museologists communicate with each other, how museums communicate with their publics, how we tell and narrate our own story, the story of the field, which terminology should produce our field when referring to decolonization, specifically of cultural processes. Now it is the time to have a discussion with our panelists, hopefully connecting all these issues. But before taking questions from our attendees, and Anne and I would like to propose a question to start to break the ice and give a bit time to our public to ask their questions. We remind you that we don't have translation services, so we encourage you to ask and answer questions in English. In case that anyone wants to ask questions in French or in Spanish, I will do my best to translate them and share them to our panelists. So, dear panelists, language is a theme that many mention. We leave it up to you to identify a meaning for the language of museology. What would you change in the language of museology to decolonize it? Have a little time to think. If anyone wants to answer it, you can go ahead.
I could just briefly answer. Well, first, in order to change something on the language of museology, you should think about what is the language of museology, which is not so easy somehow. And if it was common, it would be really wonderful somehow, even if it was colonially common. But actually, and unfortunately, I would say that there's no one possibility of conceiving museology. As you know, you have some important traditions that are not exactly the same, which is important. And this is somehow, I would say, which is very common to most social science. The idea of all of these disciplines, such as museology, is really linked with the language, which means that actually, as we are, all of us, we are here in order to discuss in a language which is not our language, except for Anne. Which is somehow very difficult also, because we have to master it and to try to master it the best one. So a global proposal should be to conceive a kind of totally artificial language that could be shared by everybody. But this, of course, there were a lot of languages, artificial languages that were invented, but such as, I don't know, Esperanto, Volapük, etc. But nothing worked. And of course, from a pragmatic point of view, of course, everybody shows the most common language. And a long time ago, the most common language was French. And just after, before it was also Latin, at least in the Western part. And now, of course, in a global part, because we live now in a real global world where the ambition of each countries, each major superpower is to rule the world. And of course, English is now the global vehicle to rule the world. So, of course, this is a fact. It's not possible to change it, I would say. So the most important, at least, should be to try to think about a more inclusive way of conceiving, of course, museology, because we are still in the process of building this language, this common language, which means that we try to grab some experiences and way of thinking, especially in ICOFOM, from all parts of the world, in order to conceive what could be a global language. But then also, of course, it's also linked with the definition of museum. What is a museum? And we come back to the one of the points, which is, of course, which took a lot of time for ICOFOM and which still takes a lot of time for ICOM to work on it, which is what should we include in the museum field? How should we conceive the center or the structure of the museum phenomenon, and how is it? And of course, then, if for instance, we just conceive museums and they're linked with a collection, which is a kind of very classical process, which was the construction, which was linked with the construction of the modern concept of museum in the 18th century. of course, we are missing some other ways of conceiving museums around the world, which were not called museums somehow also in New Zealand and in other parts of, for Amerindians, we just heard in the previous conference that, of course, the relation between objects and the First Nations was totally different, and they are not so much interested in collections of objects. So, of course, the way of conceiving now global heritage is, of course, changing. So we are continuing to deal with this, etc. So all of these, this discussion of concerning decolonialism, etc., could be also integrated in the reflection on all of the global concepts trying to structure the field of museology. This is how I could understand, and I could speak.
Yes, I agree with François Mairesse, because I emphasize that in today's multicultural world connected by the internet, any language problem overcomes through an agreement of the common language in scientific discourse. As we can see, we can see the example of natural science, which have chosen English as a common language, and many problems decide on this way. And museology maybe follow on this example. Because the many language using in our sphere by colleagues, it's very difficult to connect to a relationship between specialists.
Thank you. There is one question that is related to the ongoing conversation. What then about the decolonization of the use of words as museum, museology, and so on? I think the ICOFOM definition, the now or the future one, is a Western thing that we try to decolonize, but with Western tools. We're talking about the definition of museum as well.
Definition.
Well, I can react, of course, also. Of course, this is true, and but the important point also is that if you just think about as I said, if you just think about the repetition of the museum phenomenon around the world, what is called museum, for instance, in UNESCO statistics for the 193 countries from UNESCO, the number of museums is now estimated to 95,000 museums around the world. But somehow you have 35,000 or 33,000 in the United States, 38 or 40,000, I would say, in Western Europe. And somehow also you see that even if a lot of countries are speaking about the huge development of museum phenomenon around the world, etc., the repetition is totally is actually continues to say that it still is, of course, linked with a Western phenomenon and a Western conception of what is I would say a Western activity that, of course, was adopted by a lot of countries. With more influence, and I would say also that these different countries are starting to influence the museum world, but it takes some time. At least you needed you could see a difference between the 19th century and the 20th century, for instance, with the influence of the American way of thinking about the museum. started to emerge long time ago. But it started to really influence the museum world as a whole, not in the beginning of the 20th century, but I would say during the 30s. So you needed, after United States became the first world power at the beginning of the 20th century, you had 20 to 30 years of evolution, and then it started to influence the world. So it means also, what does it mean? It means also that, of course, the evolution of such powers such as Japan or China, etc., will definitely change the conception of the world. And somehow also, it's partly the case with Latin America. But it takes some time first. Second, also, it might mean that the museum phenomenon could totally evolve somehow within the next decades. I don't know if it's necessary to speak about deconstructions, etc. It's just a kind of evolution that could be interesting to follow and to understand.
Thank you. We have another question. Unfortunately, I don't have the name of the person asking the question, but this is someone asking whether or not there can be a universal museological practice that prioritizes and respects local voices and local cultures when not even the perception of time is universal among different cultures. Indigenous cultures have different expressions of art forms that museums label as ethnographic as opposed to art. Even the periodization of the history of the Philippines is written according to colonial occupations. Does decolonization of museology need a decolonization of the educational system first?
I suppose the political decolonization is accompanied the cultural decolonization, as we can see in the paper of Zimbabwe, Brazil, and Cote d'Ivoire, and so on. That's why I suppose the term of decolonization maybe some decades late, because process of political decolonization, which have been at 1940 till 1960, it's the past time for modern practice of museum, and I suppose the new concepts, not the concept of decolonization, is correspond to the modern museum practice. Sorry for my English.
Thank you, Petrunina.
If you want, I can also react.
Yes, go ahead.
But I would say that first, the process of decolonization is a kind of a violent process somehow. You need to understand that it engages power. So of course, respect for all local societies and consideration for all the communities, global inclusions, etc. All of these are very beautiful ways of considering things, and a possible way of conceiving museology, a global view of museology, etc., due to respect, etc. But allow me to doubt about this possibility of engaging that, as if you just look at history, you could realize that, of course, all of this process of listening to the other peoples, etc., they are not, they do not happen like that. They are always based also on confrontation of power. And then if you consider this decolonialism movement, of course, it's linked with power and confrontation. It means also, as I don't know who told it, I think it's Petrunina in her speech, that of course museums are just associated with power. They are linked, they are symbols of powers, they are houses of soft power, but they are also the symbol of the power of a nation or the entity that created the museum. So of course, this is a question of power, and the equilibrium of power is very important to understand if you want to understand a kind of deconstruction or decolonialism, etc. So this is the reason why I'm much more fan on the geopolitical approach concerning the museum in order to explore, for instance, this idea of decolonialism. Because I think it's much more very worthwhile to consider actually these debates just from the point of view of power relations.
Thank you. We have another question from Etienne Gagnon. Thank you for your presentations. You all addressed in your own ways the reality of museologists to rely on their own close cultural context to make sense of the museum as a center of activity. But a given cultural context, a given point of view, could certainly shed light in another cultural context, does it not? In that way, would the priority for museology be not to see beyond the close context, but to see value in the reality observed by different divergent views?
Could you repeat your question maybe more slowly?
Yes, the question is about the role of museums in showing different realities. So there's someone that asked if perhaps that should be the priority for museology, to see beyond the close context and to see the value in realities observed in different places or divergent views. So it's sort of this duality of wanting to recognize close and immediate context, but also the museum as a medium to get in touch with views that are far, let's say.
Maybe could you tell it in Spanish for Susana?
Yes, of course. I have questions for Susana as well. So Susana, can you hear me? I don't see you. I want to make sure she's there because I don't see her. Okay.
Yes,
Yes. Ok, gracias Susana por tu paciencia. La pregunta que están haciendo es acerca de las formas que los museos pueden contribuir a, yo diría, acortar las distancias y, digamos, de mostrar contextos locales y a la vez contextos más lejanos. La pregunta es en este sentido, si la museología no debería más bien concentrarse en esa capacidad que tienen los museos para mostrar la realidad observada a partir de diferentes puntos de vista que no sean los locales. Es una pregunta sobre esas formas en las que los museos pueden conectar geopolíticamente diferentes culturas y generar, yo creo que un contacto de esa forma. Entonces es la tensión entre lo local y lo global, parecería. No sé si tengas alguna... ¿Sí?
Yo quería hacer un comentario tratando de, digamos, de englobar o de responder a las preguntas que han hecho previamente. Por una parte, me parece, al menos para mí, es bastante interesante este ejercicio, digamos, hablando de desde diferentes idiomas o hablando de diferentes lenguajes. Pienso que sobre la pregunta de decolonizar la museología, en parte yo agradezco la posibilidad de poder, digamos, poder participar y poder comunicarme desde el español, ¿no? Que es el idioma en el que me resulta, pues digamos, más fácil, ¿no? La comunicación. Eso creo que es en parte, o es parte de ese ejercicio, ¿no? De decolonizar. También creo que las tecnologías pueden ayudar bastante, ¿no? O sea, en esta cuestión de poder, también, cuando eso no es posible, nos obliga a aperturarnos hacia otros idiomas o hacia otros lenguajes. Y también creo que en este ejercicio de decolonizar la museología, pues hace falta también digamos, como esta amplitud o esta apertura a escuchar otras voces, no solamente, digamos, desde lo académico o desde los especialistas, desde las disciplinas, aún siendo disciplinas, digamos, sociales. Me parece que eso es importante, poder escuchar también las opiniones o las necesidades de los públicos, de las comunidades. En ese sentido, pienso que también es importante sobre la segunda pregunta de, acá la tenía anotada. Perdone, se me perdió un poco la conexión.
Hablas de
sobre
la
la definición de museo.
Dale,
sobre la
dale.
definición de museo también. Me parece que es importante no solamente considerar, digamos, o no solamente tener en consideración este parámetro del occidental, sino también en relación con desde quienes se define, ¿no? Desde quienes se gesta como esta propuesta en relación a lo que es el museo. Yo me pregunto también por esta única definición sobre el museo, que si bien nos puede hacer en común, también creo que limita en términos de lo generalizable, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, pienso que en relación con lo que puede representar un museo, o sea, no tiene que ser una ni otra, ¿no? O sea, no tiene que ser o representar, o si es mejor que se represente lo local, o si es mejor que se representen, digamos, otras culturas fuera como del contexto, fuera de lo cotidiano, sino que más bien la posibilidad del museo está en poder, digamos, en poder entablar como este diálogo, ¿no? Desde lo que nos representa, digamos, como, o nos puede representar como culturas locales, y que eso puede ser, digamos, el acercamiento que tienen otros desde afuera, pero al mismo tiempo poder representar otras culturas que nos acerquen y que nos permitan conocer otras comunidades.
Thank you, Susana. You have worked with audience studies, tú has trabajado, tengo entendido que has trabajado de cerca con estudios de público, y me preguntaba cómo esta experiencia nutrió realmente tu paper y ese punto de vista importante de, a pesar de estar hablando de museología como campo de conocimiento, sin duda es necesario tener a los públicos presentes en la discusión.
Sí, creo que el planteamiento finalmente va hacia esta, digamos, comunicación, o hacia este diálogo entre la propuesta del museo, o sea, del personal, las disciplinas, la temática, en relación con, pues, digamos, un receptor o alguien con quien se pueda realmente... pues también las experiencias van en diferentes sentidos, ¿no? O sea, es decir, desde propuestas que se centran mucho más en cuestiones estadísticas o intereses en relación con la cantidad de los visitantes, y también experiencias que se centran más en función de, digamos, de lo cualitativo en relación con las significaciones o con los sentidos. Un poco hacia allá va como la inquietud y lo que trato de digamos, de plasmar y de proponer en este sentido, o sea, cómo es que el guión, ¿no? O cómo es lo que principalmente puede como representar o sostener el discurso dentro del museo, el guión curatorial, puede ser también, digamos, como este instrumento o este ejercicio de poder en relación con lo que se determina y se establece desde las especialidades o desde, digamos, desde los saberes propiamente del museo, sin entablar como realmente este diálogo o considerar como directamente a los públicos o a las comunidades, ¿no? Más o menos en este sentido es la propuesta y sí, por supuesto, es pues desde mi quehacer, desde lo que me dedico a hacer, que son estudios de públicos.
Gracias, Susana. Thank you, Susana, for those who aren't able to understand Spanish. This is a very symbolic exercise. But Susana was mentioning that from her experience with audiences and audience studies, there's definitely a link to make there and to have involved the publics in the conversation about the changing of the structure of the museum, of the languages of the museum as well. There is a comment here. Susana raises aspects of friction or humanistic activities in tension, because this decolonization is sometimes confused with a deinstitutionalization of the museum space and the resistance to the loss of governance and the granting of legitimacy to the research activity in the museum. Certainly, there is talk of inclusive and emancipatory spaces, but the asymmetry of the relationship with the public and publics is evident in most of the museums. And this is someone writing from Spain. So this is, again, in the same sense of how we are discussing issues that feel theoretical, but are necessarily connected to the experiences of visitors in museums, and how perhaps decolonization can even mean a deinstitutionalization of the museum. So if anyone wants to jump in this reflection about this tension between both practice and theory, but also the role of museums and the deinstitutionalization of them as a decolonial practice as well.
Well, it's a possibility, of course, but it's not the only one, and it happens, of course, for some museums, but of course not all of them. And so of course it's a very important practice that was raised, and the link between theory and practice, of course, obvious on this point. But at some other points, of course, or with some other views, it's also possible to conceive the other side, I would say.
Thank you. And if I have a question here from our panelist, and Davis, who was wondering if you could have an idea or a suggestion or a reflection about how your national museums in all of your contexts could decolonize. So we're talking about the Louvre or Hermitage or the Museum of Anthropology, the Museo de Antropología de México. Perhaps to link this reflection to the actual practice and experience of museology.
Would you like to start, Petrunina?
As I understand, in my museum, where I have worked more than 30 years, the State Tretьяков Gallery, the problem of decolonization is not considered at all, because our practice development in other field, and it is difficult for me to definite attention, my colleague and me, to this problem, decolonization, because we consider the process in our culture in another coordinator. So on. Maybe I don't correctly your question, but my answer it is.
Of course, if you think about the relation between decolonization and the Louvre, this is very difficult and harsh topic, I would say. But it's interesting to think about it. Somehow, I would answer differently. I would not answer from through I would say classical colonies, but I would answer through the campaign that was given by the French just after the French Revolution by the French army in order to invade first Belgium and then part of Germany, Italy, etc. And a lot of paintings were taken, etc. And of course, after Napoleon lost Waterloo in 1815, most of the works of art were given back. It was not like that because it was the first one of the first major restitution, and somehow what is to be known is the fact that before Waterloo, you know that there was what we call les 100 jours. First, Napoleon already lost the war, and then he came back, and there was this episode where at that moment when the king arrived in France, all of the given collection was to be kept at the Louvre and not given back. And it was not. It was just after 1815 that all of the different countries decided to receive back and to ask most of the works of art from the Louvre to return to Italy, to France, to Belgium, etc. But what is interesting is the point first also that not all of the works of art were given back. For instance, now a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, a very important work was done by the Belgian government, and they've just published a very interesting book on the restitutions of the works of art from the French government, in order to show that there are some works of art that were taken and they are still back in France. And the interest, why am I speaking about that? I'm speaking about all of these restitution process, etc., because it gives also the question, it means also the question of how far should we come back in order to decolonize? Should we restitute some other things, etc.? Of course, we could speak about maps of the Parthenon and other stuff, but also we could speak about some objects that were previously kept during the Roman army when they were taken from one part to another part in Europe, etc. So if we think about the decolonization process, how far should we go? Do we just speak about the last colonies, or should we come back to the colonies of the Roman Empire? Why not? And should we not consider the present colonies, which to my mind are much more important to consider, because you could also consider that we are just ruled by one superpower with a lot of big colonies also. And then you could understand somehow that this global work of decolonization is not totally, I would say, continued. the contemporary time, I would say. So if I have to answer for the Louvre and decolonialization of the Louvre, I would say, of course, it's possible to think about these restitutions, etc. But I would say that, are these really important colonialization or decolonialization processes? I saw a lot of exhibitions that were given, that were mounted by, for instance, the Natural History Museum in New York, or other American museums, explaining how their display were badly mounted, etc., because they gave some bad views on people, etc. And it's very interesting from a museological point of view and for all of the points of view to see that. But isn't this types of restitutions, or isn't this types of display just a kind of what I could say in French, un tour de passe-passe, a conjuring trick in order to hide something that is much more important and much more interesting, which is the real power relation between present states and the new colonies in the world.
Thank you, François. Susana, do you have something to share with us about the decolonization of national museums in México? ¿Cómo se vive ese debate, por ejemplo, en el Museo de Antropología? ¿Te perdimos, Susana?
¿Me pueden escuchar?
Sí, te escuchamos. No te vemos, pero te escuchamos. Ya.
Ok, tengo problemas con la conexión.
Si quieres, puedes apagar la cámara.
Es una pregunta bastante complicada. Pienso que en parte comentaba, ¿se puede escuchar mejor?
Sí, te escuchamos. Susana? We're going to give Susana a couple of minutes, perhaps, to stabilize the connection. We have a question from the chat de la part de Monsieur Raymond Monpetit. Prendre en compte la décolonisation implique-t-elle la fin de la notion de musée universel? Does decolonizing mean the end of the notion of universal museum?
Well, at least there is a conflict, that's for sure, between these two versions, of course. What is interesting is the fact that the universal idea of the museum that was launched in the 18th century is definitely attacked. Of course, especially in France, within the Louvre, for what concerns the Quai Branly, etc. Definitely there is a huge opposition between these two concepts. I would say that there are some places for both, but it's very interesting to see that they are now confronting totally together like this, and it might be interesting to try to analyze how they could fit together somehow, and if it's possible to have this wider view. As one of the previous colleague was asking, a global view of museology, considering that one of the possibilities for museum could be a kind of working on universal, global ideas that would fit for all the people, for the whole community, for all the scientific and the museum and the people community. And some other ones that could explain that, of course, if you think about decolonialization, it means that, of course, you have to consider not only a global and major view, but of course also think about local points of view. It was, if I come back to my Belgian point of view, my Belgian history, it was for universal positions that the Louvre took all of the works of arts, and of course that the patrie of freedom was France and was Paris. And of course, this was very fully accepted in France, but not as much in Belgium, where all of the Rubens paintings were kept, and they thought that, of course, it would be very interesting to let them here. And of course, even at that moment, the universal position was just a kind of point of view that was given by actually the people who had the power. If you have the power, then you also think that, of course, it's possible to think that your point of view is universal. But somehow it's also a question that should be tackled from different perspectives, but not without avoiding that they are also linked with these power equilibriums.
Thank you. I wonder, we are almost arriving to noon, so I don't know, and do you think we should finish, or given that we started 10 minutes late, we can continue?
Well, I'm wondering if Susana's connection is more secure now, and if it is, if we could hear from her just once more.
Yes, Susana, ¿nos puedes oír?
Oh dear.
Creo que no.
Creo que no. Well, then maybe let's take this opportunity to thank the three presenters very, very much. I think that you have each put forward a number of important ideas for the rest of the symposium. And if the rest of the symposium is as rich as this panel, I think that we will be very lucky. I also want to thank you, Maria, Juliana, of course, too, for all your work on this. It's been very exciting working with you. And for everybody, there's another panel starting at 1 o'clock this afternoon. So I hope you can join us then. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, and likewise. Thank you, everyone.
Maria.
Thank you very much.
Bonjour. Bye-bye.
So thank you very much to our first panel moderators who did a wonderful multilingual exercise. And of course, to our first panelists for the fascinating discussion. As Mrs. Davis mentioned, we are now going to take a break until 1 p.m. Montreal time. And during this break, we invite our panelists and members of the audience to continue the discussion in a virtual social event, whose link has been sent in the webinar chat and earlier this morning in the Eventbrite email. So we'll see you, hopefully, everybody back at 1 p.m. Thank you very much.